Our marvelous modern Isaiah text has evolved through a tortuous path of time and circumstances. The Hebrew text includes direct quotes from the Lord, the prophet, historians, and editorial comments, all intermingled in prose and poetry, making it complex and very difficult to accurately wordprint. Because of the complex nature of the Isaiah text, we're not able to calculate simple wordprint answers. But yet, if we take care, we can gain some insight and come to a better understanding of the text and its structure. Word printing is based on what appears to be a normal human phenomena. Without being conscious or aware of it, when we freely speak or freely write, each of us use different personal preferences of the available arbitrary non-contextual word patterns. In this study, we test 5,000 word texts with a set of 65 different word patterns, such as combinations of the common non-contextual words like and, the, of, that, with, it, in. We've spent 14 years now in developing this scientific measuring tool. And I will want to talk about can we use and how much of it can we use meaningfully in looking at the text from which we get Isaiah. The first view graph I'd like shown illustrates in a sort of a mathematical schematic way the kind of thing that I will be reporting on. Now, at the top, we talk about three different texts of a first author. In this context, they're going to be 5,000 words, and we're going to make 65 different independent checks within each one, you know. But up on the first author, we see the green lines. Within author testing, we're going to test text 1 against text 2 against text 3. This way we can tell how much stability there is within author 1. Then we come down below and we identify author 2, and we want to compare these two authors together. But before we do that, we want to test the internal stability between author number 2, and we have the within author green on the bottom. And then after having completed the within author test, so we can see how stable this author is in these particular non-contextual word patterns, we then want to compare first author against second author with all of the different between author tests. And as statisticians, we're able to add all of this together in a way that we come out with a scientific measurement which can help us get a feel for what is the underlying personality or a wordprint personality of the author 1 and the author 2. And we want to put that to Isaiah right now. This only works, of course, I better caution us a little bit, this will only work, of course, if the author is writing his own honest, free-flow, non-contextual word preferences. This is somewhat like random numbers are. You know, an author cannot write a full random number chart. The mind doesn't do that. Well, similar there here. But we cannot measure authors who, for instance, don't give me their own free flow choices, but some way cover it up with some sort of an external thing, such as an author who deliberately quotes someone else extensively. Well, of course, the plagiarized document is not going to show any personal habits of the writing of the plagiarist. And so we must be very cautious, of course, about whether it's free-flow writing or not. What it is that we want to take each one of the 5,000 word texts, let's measure all of them with this measuring procedure against a standard list of 12 19th, 20th century control authors. Let's measure all of our texts against this same group of authors, you know, like Mark Twain and Samuel Johnson and so on. Let's measure all of our texts against that, and with this we are able to see how much the author is honestly writing like a human writes, And in fact, whether he is writing like a 19th, 20th century English writer or whether he's writing like some other groups of people, and we'll see some of them. Now, as we go to the Isaiah text, the Old Testament Isaiah text, since the discovery of the 1st century BC large Isaiah text among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is no question that our present 66-chaptered Hebrew Masoretic text is structurally, and as far as Wordprints are concerned, identical to the Hebrew text that was available in Palestine when Jesus taught there. Now, there are quite a few little differences, and Royal Skousen talked about those earlier this morning. But as far as Wordprints are concerned, we aren't able to measure those kind. And the ancient text now seems to be apparently identical to what we have seen, and of course it's the same text from which all of the translations, all of the standard translations have been made of the Isaiah text that I have available to us, including the King James Version. The pie chart that's shown up here is what the Isaiah text looks like when, as a word printer, we need to divide it up. Because, of course, I cannot compare quoted words from other people, because, of course, this will just hide the pattern I'm looking for. Similarly, we have a dramatic difference when we shift to poetry. When an author tries to write poetry, he no longer can report the free flow pattern that he would like to use. He has to rearrange his sentence, rearrange his words so that the cadence comes out correctly. So if we're going to seriously look to the Isaiah text, we have to divide apart the poetry. We have noticed there are almost 20,000 words of poetry from the Isaiah text, about 3,000 words of prose from Isaiah. He then quotes the Lord with about 10,000 words. The Lord quotes him in poetry with 10,000 words. He quotes him with prose with 2,500 words. A couple of thousand words of a historian are in there. This Isaiah text is the one which for centuries biblical scholars have haggled over in what has become known as the Isaiah problem. There are some Bible critics who argue that the exact words in the first 40 chapters of the text could possibly have come from a pre-Babylonian Isaiah, son of Amoz, but that the remaining 26 chapters must have been written by some second Isaiah or Deutero-Isaiah or some other combination of writers, and he must have been writing after the Babylonian exile. As you'll, about 25 years ago, when word printing was just beginning to be thought of seriously, and it was found that in some cases one could do this kind of a study, it was thought that, well, gee, this big Isaiah problem could be examined. You could determine which author was which. And we, at least within LDS circles, there are two prominent studies that were done there. Dr. Adams did a study on the Isaiah, on the Hebrew Isaiah, from here at Brigham Young University, and Dr. Radeh of Haifa did another extensive study. At the time when these were first published, as I say, 20 years ago or so, there was the interpretation made of these two studies seemed to be contradictory, so that they didn't really end up helping very much for the scholars who thought they wanted to argue this other point. Nowadays, however, as we're able to look at the studies that were done previously, there are some serious problems involved in there, and we would certainly recommend that now one not accept the conclusions of either one of them as particularly reliable. I ought to mention in what were some of the fundamental problems. The studies did not differentiate between prose and poetry, and yet this makes an enormous difference, as you'll see as soon as we start measuring. They did not, for instance, work out test patterns which could really stably identify an author. They just took whatever was convenient at the time. Furthermore, in the Adams study, there was I guess a common type of an error made. What he really measured was that all the way across the Isaiah text, there might have been one author. This was generally interpreted to mean he has proven statistically that there is but one author. And of course, that wasn't what was able to be proven and with that kind of a measurement. Now, I want to talk about the Book of Mormon and the Book of Isaiah. The Book of Mormon is in English, and therefore we need to use an English wordprint if we want to relate to it. But then we're going to be talking about texts of other languages, and so this introduces a significant problem. But in the English Book of Mormon, it came, of course, from translated Reformed Egyptian by Joseph Smith by the unusual procedure of gift and power of God. This is not a normal academic text, nor was it a normal academic translation. Yet, in many ways, it often measures as if it is. The Book of Mormon contains quotations from 22 of the 66 chapters of the Old Testament Isaiah. Now, the amazing thing about trying to do Isaiah in the Book of Mormon is that the Isaiah is identical to the King James wording. Now, some of our lectures today have made it very clear that at times the prophet Nephi said, "These are my words," when he meant my themes in someone else's words, sort of thing. But in word printing, I'm not able to determine themes or this kind of thing. We're only able to measure the exact words that are there. Why did the Lord inspire Joseph Smith to render the information gained from the gold plates in the very familiar and easily identifiable King James Version wording is not explicitly stated? Along with other reasons, perhaps the Lord wished us to unmistakably understand that he gives the same important information to all of his children, both in Palestine and America. Therefore, for Joseph Smith's King James Version Bible reading generation, the Lord had Joseph Smith translate this same important information given the Nephites in exactly the familiar words that the readers already associated with the Palestine Isaiah revelation. But whether this was really the full reason or not, whatever was his reason, the precise King James wording did end up in the Book of Mormon, and it, of course, did not get there by accident. Stated this in another way, since the Isaiah text in the Book of Mormon is unmistakably worded as is the King James Version, we may be assured that no matter whatever helps or abuses the Old Testament text suffered between its first revelation to the ancient prophet Isaiah until it was published in the form of the translation of the King James Version, the resulting King James structure and wording are adequately good to fulfill the Lord's purposes. Our English Isaiah is translated from Hebrew into English, and it presents some wordprint problems, some of which I have already alluded to. One of the big problems is, of course, the language differences. Fortunately, we find, and I guess this is kind of surprise to many, fortunately we find in word printing that if the translation has been made in a careful, literal, academic sense, that we are able to measure a unique pattern of the original author even through the translation. And in fact, it is so good that in some foreign language translations, it's very difficult to tell that there's ever even been a translation. We measure the pattern just as clearly, for instance, in Chinese writers who have been translated into English. We measure just as much difference between their English words, and that is identifying them as individual writers, as we could expect to measure under any set of conditions. So if it's that kind of translation, it works very good. Greek and Hebrew both give us the same sort of phenomena, although in the case of the Hebrew, I think you will agree with me, we tend to lose sensitivity on identifying the author. In Greek, it looked awfully good, as we did the Greek New Testament this way. Let's look at our next word print. What we're going to look at is the procedure where we test all the 5,000 word texts that we're going to look at against the 12 control authors. And we're able to see some amazing things. This is a very composite curve, and I apologize for that, but we couldn't see how I could put all the data up there any other way. Let's sort of ignore everything except up here on the right-hand corner. The diamond shape S curve, it runs from 0% to 100%. That means this represents, well, it really represents hundreds of tests that we have made. I only put 12 of them up here because the 12 span very well the whole 19th, 20th century where English authors appear. The S curve, as it runs up there, has all sorts of good theoretical meaning and so on that we can argue from. But what it says is that when Mark Twain writes, in fact, Mark Twain's up there in 4 different places. He goes off across the curve. And when Samuel Johnson writes, he's up there. Joseph Smith is not up there, but when he does write, he is right on it too. And in fact, everyone who is writing a free-flow 19th, 20th century English seems to land close enough to this so that we reject any supposed 19th or 20th century author who doesn't come close to this as saying, well, he's probably done something, he's quoting somebody else, and he's not representative of a free-flow person writing. Now, that's 19th, 20th century. Elizabethan English moves over a little bit. The dotted line, the authors who write there, and we've studied a great number of those kind of authors. This was being done when Shakespeare was writing, and it was being done when the translation of the King James Version was going on. And we see that it moves over about 1 rejection. Now, the important part of this curve is that if you come down to the bottom, I don't know that you can read the scale at the bottom, but it says mean rejections. And the 19th, 20th century went someplace between about 6 and 8.5. Well, we find that the Elizabethan English writers who are writing prose, they came over about 1.5, 1 more. They moved a little ways away. You can see the language drifted, but only went a little ways. I don't show it here, but when we do Shakespeare, remember, Shakespeare is writing in poetry now, and he has his iambic pentameter type rhythm that he has to be into all the time. We find that Shakespeare is over here more like 10, 11, or 12, clear across the chart. And he is identically on top of his colleagues who are writing the same type of poetic plays. That is, if I had it plotted up there, you'd see that Shakespeare would just interleafed himself with Christopher Marlowe or Ben Jonson, the other playwrights who were writing that way in his day and age. So that we see that poetry is going to move it over a substantial ways. Then let's start to look what happens when you translate. Back on the other side, please put the marker over on German. Yeah. There is the S curve that we get from a large number of German translations. We did our original studies in foreign language in German and were amazed to find how stable it was, except at the top of the curve, when I initially did it, it was not stable. And we used to make lots of measurements to try to figure out what this author, von Kleist, translated into English. How come he wasn't stable with the other German authors? I finally contacted the scholar who did the translation about 28 years ago or something, and he's an elderly gentleman now, and I said, do you happen to remember anything about the von Kleist translation which would make it so unique? He immediately came back at me, why, that man writes in an impossible language. I couldn't any more translate him correctly. He goofs up the grammar, and blah, 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 and I had to chop his sentences all up and rearrange his words within those sentences so I could put him into meaningful English. I've never done that to any other author, and I hope I never have to. I realize it's not good, but what he was telling me is I had to paraphrase him. I couldn't translate him. And he did not follow the S curve. Well, maybe that answered all of my problems in that regard. Now, let's move over and see what happens when we look at the translated Hebrew poetry from Isaiah. We have a lot of examples from Jeremiah the same way, so let's plot both of them, and we plot it with 2 of the 5 different English translations that we have studied. RSV, Revised Standard Version, Modern English. So it has jumped over from the triangular S curve over to there, and that's translated poetry as read in the Old Testament. Then we go to the King James Version. We find that it moved over a little bit further, yet it's in Elizabethan English, of course, as we find close approximations, anyway, in the Book of Mormon, to it, and that's where the poetry stands. Now let's come down to the curve below that and see it's the same curve, of course. Over here it represents the 19th, 20th century writer, and move over to the Hebrew prose. And by this time, Jeremiah is the one to give us an example of how it goes, and we have the two different translations there, and we see about the same technique. They're all falling on the same S-curve, and we're able to see that the King James Version, this is translated Jeremiah coming to us, it's way off to the right from what normal 19th, 20th century writing is. And the astounding thing about it is that if you come down, you see the King James Version, someplace 14.5 rejections, maybe up to 1920, something like that is where that S-curve goes. Right below it, I have plotted what we measure for the Book of Mormon. For the Isaiah text of the Book of Mormon, it says ISI right where the pencil is pointing right now. That's where the average of Isaiah falls in the Book of Mormon. Well, no big surprise. It comes right out of what we would expect with this kind of a language. But then we find that Nephi, Jacob, and Lehi, all first-generation writers, the ones who made up the small plates in the Book of Mormon, all measure right in the, precisely what we measure for the 600 BC writers. Isaiah is there under ISI, Nephi is there under NE, and this is his own didactic writing, supposedly his free-flow sermonizing. And in fact, we compare all Book of Mormon authors. The only ones we measure is didactic, hopefully free-flow writing is what we have up there. Anyway, we find, though, that other Book of Mormon authors, Green, way down here at the bottom end, Alma, we have 19,000 words of him in didactic writing, but he's of the large plates of a later generation. We find he moves clear off from where the Hebrew prose was being written. Furthermore, we find that 500 years later, when Mormon and Moroni, who cluster together, father and son, they're in a different place yet. So what we appear to be measuring here is a dramatic shift between the Book of Mormon texts, including Isaiah, but those who are around him, who appear to be in, at least they're measuring the same, as if they had used 600 BC Hebrew. Now then, that's astounding to us, but I guess not surprising. The large plate sections where they're using completely different languages, they measure in different places. Here's a way we statisticians like to display a great amount of information. It's called principal component analysis. It's a way of trying to put most of the variables that we're going to measure in all of my 65 word prints, put them into 2 or 3 or 4 dimensions so we can get a grasp of it. I plotted what the computer prints out here for us in 3 dimensions. 4 you can't see. Now, you'll notice here that Joseph Smith, the little red one, we see that he clusters very tightly. Now the clustering means that, well, he's writing the same way. Statistically, he looks like himself. And so this is the within author checking to see how good he is. The little red one down here represents Joseph Smith when he wrote letters to Emma and to the church, his own handwriting material, together with Joseph Smith tells his own story that we publish in the Great Price, is what I was trying to say. Okay, now then we compare that with Oliver Cowdery, who sometimes is accused of having written the Book of Mormon, you know. We compare it against Oliver Cowdery's own writings. Oliver Cowdery did a great deal of it, so we've got a lot of examples of his own writing, and he clusters very much off across the page here from Joseph Smith, and therefore they're completely different writings. We aren't surprised. Then let's look at what happens when we do the Book of Mormon. Now this is, of course, assuming that the Book of Mormon was an invention of the 19th century type of English language, as some people might speculate. And if so, we find that Alma sits completely independent of both Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, and that Nephi, see, we had almost 20,000 words of Alma, and we have 15,000 words of Nephi, which can be directly compared. But we find that they're completely on the other part of the probability curve of where this kind of an author stands. So what this has done is it's completely negated the hypothesis on which this study was made. That is, that it was all a 19th century type of an English production by somebody. It certainly wasn't by Joseph Smith, and it certainly wasn't by Oliver Cowdery, but it turns out that it wasn't by anybody, because there are at least the two independent ones that we see there. Let's look at Isaiah. Isaiah we cannot do nearly as well. See, Isaiah is filled with poetries here and proses over there, and this author on top of quotations from this other person. So we do the best we can, and I'll show you what that is. Here, the green color up here is the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah. And we can just see how he kind of behaves. The large green clustering up here front is Jeremiah as he quotes the Lord in prose. Now then, when Jeremiah quotes the Lord in poetry, that's the other little green one over here. So we see that the poetry is really mixing things up, and that's why these early studies, of course, couldn't be expected to come up with a consistent answer on it. Now then, it turns out that we also have in the Jeremiah text Baruch, the clerk, the secretary, who came and introduced himself halfway through the book, and just delightfully explains what he's doing. He measures very independent off here over the side. You can see his clustering is all over here, and so he's not to be confused with the other authorship. Now, let's look to the red, and this is where we get into our trouble with Isaiah. We're not able to do much there because of the inter-quoting of each other, and we see that they're very tightly, everybody's very close together. There's no big differences like we were able to see with other authors. But if you look at it here, you can see that here is Isaiah is quoted by the Lord in poetry. Here is... and it's a little bit different, but it's amazingly close to Jeremiah's Lord in poetry. Well, they're cross-quoting each other, of course, very heavily. And so we have to kind of go, well, yeah, I guess I'm not surprised they're close there. But we do note that when we check the poetry of Isaiah himself, we get a separation, at least a little separation. These two here are Isaiah. Now, why do they separate? Is there really a Deutero-Isaiah, writing later on? I don't think so. For instance, this separation appears to occur exactly halfway through the text, not at chapter 40, where many of our scholars would have argued it should have changed. Now, maybe it's 40, and it kind of mixed up between 33 and 40, because this isn't that careful a measurement. But I suggest that this does not describe the Deutero that was looked for previously, but there is a difference, and there is a difference in pattern. Therefore, let me conclude. Here are the 4 conclusions. Early wordprint measurements have serious problems and therefore have limited usefulness for our understanding of word printing and try to help with the Isaiah text problems, the Isaiah problem. Even the most recent word print procedures cannot really help much with the Isaiah problem because they lack free flow, same genre comparisons. As you can see, we're having trouble trying to put that all together. However, the English word printing procedures do appear to give some clear information, such as the precise alignment of the Hebrew prose writers of 600 BC, as represented in the Old Testament Jeremiah, with the small didactic writing authors of the small plates of the Book of Mormon. But there is no alignment, of course, when we try to line up with the other languaged large plate authors. And for my last conclusion, what we're tentatively measuring here suggests that the exact Isaiah words, not the ideas or so on, but the exact Isaiah words in our currently transmitted text, the text that has come to us, are not in a single author's free flow writing. I don't think we're very surprised that it doesn't measure as if it is, but I say it is that way. That's what the measurement says. How the mixed patterns of prose and poetry, the Lord speaking, the third-person historian, etc., came to our present form is not clear. We can't measure that with word printing. The most straightforward suggestion is that there has been, at some time or the other, more than one editor or a nonlinear translator or a poet or a writer who has contributed to our modern text. However, I have not gone over that the Lord Jesus Christ, when his ministry in the meridian of time, as recorded in the New Testament, he quotes Isaiah 20 times. Half of those 20 are before chapter 40. Half of the 20 are behind chapter 40. Every time Jesus uses Isaiah in the New Testament, he uses him for his good, prophetic, divinely prophetic information which is predicting the messianic reign of Jesus. No matter what has happened to the text that is being measured here that I'm looking at, that is, some new editor came in and changed it, or a poet rewrote somebody else's poetry, or whatever has happened there, the complete text of Isaiah is certainly unity in Jesus' mind, as he quoted it extensively all the way through his ministry. Therefore, while as a scientist I have to say, well, yeah, we're measuring some noise in there, and I don't really know what it means, but I do have complete confidence as a testimony, as a Christian, that no, the whole text of Isaiah has unity as Jesus saw it. And I have been delighted today to be able to enjoy some of the magnificence that we learn from accepting the whole text, albeit that the manuscript that's come down to me that I'm able to measure these exact words for still provide problems for us. Thank you very much.